The western shore of the Dead Sea is a landscape of stark contrasts. Limestone cliffs descend sharply toward a basin more than 400 meters below sea level. The air is dry, the light unfiltered, and the horizon often blurred by heat rising from salt and stone. For much of recorded history, this region lay at the margins of settled life, a frontier between cultivated highlands and desert wilderness. Yet in the mid-20th century, these cliffs yielded one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era, a cache of ancient manuscripts now known collectively as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls were first brought to scholarly attention in 1947, when several leather manuscripts were acquired by antiquities dealers in Bethlehem. Their origin was traced to caves near the site of Qumran, northwest of the Dead Sea. Over the following decade, 11 caves in the vicinity would produce thousands of fragments representing hundreds of distinct manuscripts. Archaeological excavations conducted between 1951 and 1956, led primarily by Roland de Vaux of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, uncovered the ruins of a nearby settlement that appeared to date from the Second Temple period. The relationship between these ruins and the scrolls would become a central question of Dead Sea Scrolls research, one that continues to be examined and debated. Radiocarbon dating and paleographic analysis place the majority of the scrolls between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. This time frame situates them within a turbulent era of Jewish history. Following the conquests of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BCE, the eastern Mediterranean fell under Hellenistic rule. Judea passed between the control of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kingdoms before the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC established the Hasmonean dynasty. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey intervened in a dynastic dispute and incorporated Judea into the Roman sphere. The period culminated in the First Jewish Revolt against Rome, ending in 70 CE with the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple. It is against this historical backdrop that the Dead Sea Scrolls must be understood. They are not a single book, nor a unified composition, but a library, diverse in language, genre, and purpose. Most are written in Hebrew, with some in Aramaic and a smaller number in Greek. Among them are copies of biblical texts, previously unknown Jewish writings, legal documents, hymns, commentaries, and sectarian rules. Together, they offer an unparalleled window into the religious life, textual traditions, and internal debates of Judaism in the centuries before and during the rise of early Christianity. One of the most consequential aspects of the discovery lies in the biblical manuscripts. Prior to 1947, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible available to scholars was the Masoretic text preserved in medieval codices, such as the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex, dating from the 10th and 11th centuries CE. The Dead Sea Scrolls pushed the textual history of the Hebrew Bible back more than 1,000 years. Fragments of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible, except Esther, were identified among the Qumran finds. These biblical scrolls revealed both continuity and variation. In many cases, the text aligns closely with the later Masoretic tradition, demonstrating a remarkable degree of stability in the transmission of Scripture. In other instances, however, the scrolls preserve readings that differ from the Masoretic text and sometimes correspond more closely to the Greek Septuagint or the Samaritan Pentateuch. Scholars have interpreted this diversity as evidence that, during the Second Temple period, multiple textual traditions of certain biblical books circulated simultaneously. The process by which one form of the text eventually achieved dominance appears to have unfolded gradually over centuries. Beyond the biblical manuscripts, the scrolls include a substantial body of literature that had not been preserved in the later Jewish canon. Among these are works such as the Community Rule, the Damascus Document, the War Scroll, and various Pesharim, interpretive commentaries on prophetic books. These texts reflect the beliefs and practices of a particular Jewish group, often identified with the Essenes, a sect described by ancient authors including Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, and Pliny the Elder. The degree to which the Qumran community corresponds to the Essenes of classical sources remains a subject of scholarly discussion. While many researchers find significant parallels in communal structure, ritual practice, and theological outlook, others caution that the evidence is not definitive. The archaeological site of Qumran itself consists of a series of buildings arranged around courtyards, with features interpreted as ritual baths, a large assembly hall, workshops, and a possible scriptorium. Numerous inkwells were found in one of the rooms, leading early excavators to propose that manuscripts were copied on site. The presence of extensive water installations in an arid environment suggests a community attentive to ritual purity laws. Pottery from the site, including distinctive cylindrical jars, resembles containers found in some of the scroll caves. These correlations have often been cited in support of the view that the inhabitants of Qumran were responsible for at least part of the manuscript collection. However, alternative interpretations have also been proposed. Some scholars argue that the scrolls may have originated in Jerusalem or elsewhere and were hidden in the caves during the Roman advance in the late 60s CE. According to this perspective, Qumran may have served as a fortress, estate, or production center rather than a sectarian settlement. The debate illustrates the complexity of linking texts to archaeological contexts, particularly when direct inscriptions or unequivocal evidence are absent. What is clear is that the scrolls were deliberately placed in caves, many stored in jars and wrapped in linen. Their concealment appears to have been systematic. The reasons for this act are not documented in the manuscripts themselves. It is plausible that they were hidden for safekeeping during a period of instability, possibly in anticipation of Roman military action. The first Jewish revolt created conditions under which religious communities may have sought to preserve sacred writings from destruction. The climate of the Judean desert played a crucial role in the survival of the scrolls. The extreme dryness, combined with the protective environment of caves, slowed the decomposition of organic materials such as parchment and papyrus. Even so, many manuscripts were found in fragmentary condition, having suffered damage over centuries. The process of reconstructing texts from thousands of fragments has required painstaking labor, involving paleography, linguistic analysis, and increasingly advanced imaging technologies. The discovery and publication of the scrolls unfolded over decades. Early access to the materials was limited to a small team of scholars, leading to criticism and calls for broader availability. In the 1990s, photographic archives were made public, and subsequent editions and digital projects have greatly expanded access. Today, high-resolution images of many scrolls are available online, enabling researchers worldwide to examine the manuscripts directly. The content of the Dead Sea Scrolls sheds light on key themes in Second Temple Judaism: covenant, law, purity, messianism, and apocalyptic expectation. Certain texts express a dualistic worldview, portraying history as a cosmic struggle between forces of light and darkness. Others outline detailed regulations for communal life, including admission procedures, disciplinary measures, and liturgical practices. The community rule, for example, describes a structured organization with designated officials, shared property, and regular assemblies. Such texts suggest a group that understood itself as a faithful remnant, distinct from what it regarded as a corrupt or compromised religious establishment. At the same time, the scrolls reflect broader currents within Judaism. Apocalyptic writings, with their emphasis on divine judgment and eschatological hope, were not confined to a single sect. Interpretive methods found in the Pesharim, where biblical prophecy is applied to contemporary events, resonate with exegetically techniques attested in other Jewish sources. The scrolls thus contribute to a more nuanced picture of Jewish diversity in the late Second Temple period. The significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls extends beyond the boundaries of Jewish history. For scholars of early Christianity, they provide context for understanding the religious environment in which the Jesus movement emerged. Concepts such as messianic expectation, ritual immersion, communal meals, and scriptural interpretation appear in both the scrolls and early Christian writings. These parallels do not imply direct dependence, but they underscore the shared matrix of ideas circulating in first-century Judea. More than 75 years after their discovery, the Dead Sea Scrolls remain central to the study of ancient Judaism and the history of the biblical text. Their importance lies not in overturning established history, but in deepening and refining it. They offer direct testimony from a formative period, preserved by circumstance and rediscovered by chance. In the caves above the Dead Sea, fragments of parchment have endured as witnesses to a world both distant and foundational, one whose intellectual and spiritual currents continue to shape religious traditions today. The manuscripts recovered from the caves near Qumran do not represent a single literary vision. Rather, they reflect a spectrum of religious thought that developed within Judaism during the final centuries of the Second Temple period. To understand the deeper significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is necessary to examine the internal character of the collection, its theology, its legal reasoning, its scriptural interpretation, and the communal structures that shaped its production and preservation. Among the most extensively studied texts is the document commonly referred to as the Community Rule, designated by scholars as 1QS. Preserved primarily in Cave 1, this manuscript outlines the organization, discipline, and spiritual worldview of a distinct group. It describes a voluntary community bound by covenant, governed by a council, and structured around ritual purity and shared property. Entry into the group required a probationary period, during which the candidate's conduct and commitment were evaluated. Only after a staged process of integration would full membership be granted. The Community Rule emphasizes strict adherence to the Torah, but it interprets the law through a distinctive lens. The text refers repeatedly to a figure called the Teacher of Righteousness, whose identity remains unknown. Archaeological evidence does not reveal a named individual, and no external historical source securely identifies him. The manuscripts portray him as a founding leader who interpreted scripture authoritatively and whose teachings define the group's understanding of covenantal faithfulness. Some scholars propose that he lived in the 2nd century BCE, possibly during the Hasmonean period. Others suggest a slightly later date. The evidence, however, does not allow for certainty. Closely related to the Community Rule is the Damascus document, fragments of which were discovered both at Qumran and earlier in the Cairo Geniza. This text describes a covenant community that had withdrawn from what it regarded as a flawed religious establishment. It recounts a period of spiritual wandering before the community's renewal under divine guidance. The Damascus document also contains detailed legal rulings, including regulations about Sabbath observance, purity, marriage, and communal discipline. Its tone suggests both separation and reform, a conviction that correct interpretation of the law required distance from prevailing authorities in Jerusalem. The legal materials in these scrolls are particularly significant. During the Second Temple period, Jewish law was not monolithic. Different groups interpreted the Torah in divergent ways, often disagreeing on matters of calendar calculation, ritual practice, and temple administration. The scrolls provide direct evidence of such disputes. For example, one recurring issue concerns the calendar used to determine festivals. The Qumran texts advocate a solar calendar of 364 days, structured in a precise, repeating pattern. This contrasts with the lunisolar calendar later standardized in Rabbinic Judaism and likely used by the Jerusalem priesthood of the time. The adoption of a solar calendar had theological implications. A fixed, unchanging system was seen by some scholars as an expression of cosmic order and divine precision. If the temple authorities operated according to a different calendar, then festival observance would fall on different days. For a community that viewed proper timing as integral to covenantal obedience, this divergence could be interpreted as a sign of corruption. Several scrolls criticize what they describe as a wicked priest, though the identity of this figure remains uncertain. Scholars debate whether the term refers to a specific historical high priest or functions as a symbolic representation of illegitimate leadership. Another major composition, the War Scroll, presents a detailed account of an eschatological conflict between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The text outlines battle formations, trumpet signals, priestly roles, and stages of engagement. Despite its military imagery, the War Scroll does not provide concrete historical references that would tie it to a specific known conflict. Some scholars interpret it as a symbolic or liturgical document, expressing apocalyptic expectations rather than practical military planning. Others argue that it reflects genuine anticipation of armed struggle in an era marked by political instability. Apocalyptic thought, more broadly, is a defining feature of several Qumran texts. This mode of literature, also present in works such as 1 Enoch and the later Book of Revelation, envisions history as guided by divine sovereignty toward a climactic resolution. In the scrolls, this expectation is framed within a dualistic worldview. Humanity is divided between opposing camps, aligned either with truth or falsehood, light or darkness. Such language is theological rather than ethnic. It describes moral and spiritual allegiance rather than national identity. The community appears to have understood itself as chosen to uphold truth during a period of widespread deviation. Yet the Dead Sea Scrolls are not exclusively sectarian or apocalyptic. A significant portion of the collection consists of biblical manuscripts and interpretive commentaries. The Pesharim, for example, are commentaries that apply prophetic texts to contemporary circumstances. A typical Pesher cites a verse from a prophet such as Habakkuk and then explains its meaning as fulfilled in the experience of the community. This method of interpretation presumes that ancient prophecy contains hidden layers of relevance, accessible through inspired insight. The scrolls do not present these interpretations as speculative. They are framed as authoritative readings grounded in divine revelation. The presence of multiple copies of certain biblical books suggests sustained engagement with Scripture. Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah appear frequently among the fragments. The Great Isaiah Scroll, found in Cave 1, is one of the most complete manuscripts recovered. Its text, though largely consistent with the later Masoretic version, includes minor variations in spelling and wording. Such differences offer valuable data for textual criticism, allowing scholars to trace the development of biblical transmission over time. The scrolls also preserve previously unknown compositions that expand on biblical narratives. The Genesis Apocryphon, for example, retells episodes from the lives of patriarchal figures, sometimes elaborating on details absent from the canonical account. These rewritten texts demonstrate that scriptural interpretation during the Second Temple period was dynamic. The boundaries between scripture, commentary, and narrative expansion were not as rigidly defined as they would become in later centuries. Archaeological evidence from Qumran complements this literary picture. The site contains numerous ritual baths, known as mikvot, indicating concern for purity practices. The architecture includes communal spaces that may have functioned as assembly halls or dining rooms. The cemetery adjacent to the settlement holds over 1,000 graves, primarily of adult males. Anthropological analysis suggests a relatively homogeneous population, though some burials include women and children, raising questions about the precise composition of the community. The interpretation of Qumran as an Essene settlement is grounded largely in comparison with classical sources. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus describes the Essenes as a disciplined group living communally, sharing property, observing strict purity laws, and maintaining distinctive theological views. Philo of Alexandria offers a similar account, emphasizing communal meals and devotion to Scripture. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, places an Essene community along the western shore of the Dead Sea. Many scholars see these descriptions as broadly consistent with the archaeological and textual evidence from Qumran. However, some caution that the term Essene does not appear in the scrolls themselves, and the alignment cannot be proven conclusively. In recent decades, scholarly approaches to the scrolls have grown more nuanced. Rather than viewing the collection as the product of a single isolated sect, some researchers propose that it reflects a network of related groups sharing certain theological commitments. Others emphasize the possibility that the caves served as repositories for manuscripts from multiple sources, especially during the upheavals of the First Jewish Revolt. The archaeological record confirms that Qumran was destroyed around 68 CE, likely during the Roman campaign in Judea. Whether the scrolls were hidden immediately before this event or earlier remains uncertain. What remains beyond dispute is that the Dead Sea Scrolls illuminate a period of profound intellectual vitality. They reveal a Judaism marked not by uniformity, but by debate and experimentation. Legal interpretation, scriptural exegesis, apocalyptic expectation, and communal organization all appear as arenas of active reflection. The scrolls do not present a marginal anomaly. they represent one expression within a diverse religious landscape. Through these manuscripts, modern scholarship gains access to voices that would otherwise have been lost. They do not speak in dramatic tones, nor do they claim to overturn established tradition. Instead, they reflect a community deeply engaged with inherited scripture, convinced that faithful interpretation required vigilance and discipline. In their meticulous copying, careful storage, and enduring preservation, the scrolls embody a sustained commitment to textual and spiritual continuity. As the fragments continue to be studied, through linguistic analysis, radiocarbon dating, and digital imaging, they offer ever more detailed insight into the world that produced them. The hidden caves of the Judean desert have yielded not a singular revelation, but a layered archive. Within its parchment and ink lies the record of a community wrestling with covenant, authority, and expectation in an age of uncertainty, an age whose questions, though framed differently, continue to resonate in the study of history and religion today. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls did more than expand the corpus of ancient Jewish literature. It fundamentally reshaped scholarly understanding of how sacred texts were transmitted, interpreted, and preserved during the Second Temple period. Before the mid-20th century, reconstructions of early biblical history relied heavily on later manuscript traditions and scattered references in classical sources. The scrolls introduced primary evidence from within the period itself, allowing historians to observe textual development in real time. Among the most significant contributions of the scrolls is the insight they provide into the history of the Hebrew Bible. The biblical manuscripts found at Qumran reveal that the textual tradition was not yet standardized in the centuries before the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE. Instead, multiple textual forms coexisted. Some manuscripts align closely with what would later become the Masoretic text. Others reflect readings similar to the Greek Septuagint, translated in the Hellenistic period. Still others share features with the Samaritan Pentateuch. This plurality has led scholars to reconsider earlier assumptions about textual uniformity. Rather than imagining a single authoritative version of each biblical book circulating universally, it now appears more accurate to speak of a family of textual traditions. Variations include differences in spelling, word order, additions, omissions, and occasional rearrangements of material. In most cases, these differences do not alter core theological themes. However, they illuminate the processes by which scribes transmitted and, at times, shaped the text. Paleographic analysis has played a central role in dating the scrolls. By examining the forms of letters and comparing them with dated inscriptions from other contexts, scholars have established approximate chronological ranges for individual manuscripts. These findings have been supplemented by radiocarbon testing, which has generally confirmed paleographic assessments. Together, these methods situate the bulk of the scrolls between the 3rd century BCE and the mid-1st century CE. The physical characteristics of the manuscripts further reveal aspects of scribal culture. Most biblical scrolls are written on parchment made from animal skin, though some use papyrus. The ink was typically carbon-based. Many manuscripts exhibit careful column alignment and consistent letter formation, suggesting professional training. Others are more informal in appearance. Corrections are occasionally visible, inserted above lines or in margins. In some cases, scribes appear to have compared their work against other copies, marking variants or adjusting phrasing. These details point to an environment in which textual transmission was both reverent and practical. The act of copying scripture was not merely mechanical, it required interpretation. Decisions about orthography, the inclusion or exclusion of variant readings, and the resolution of ambiguous passages all shaped the form in which texts were preserved. The scrolls allow modern scholarship to trace these processes with greater precision than previously possible. In addition to biblical manuscripts, the scrolls include texts that illuminate the broader intellectual currents of the time. Wisdom literature, for example, appears in compositions that echo themes found in Proverbs and other sapiential writings. Hymnic texts express devotion in poetic form, often drawing on biblical language while introducing distinctive phrasing. The Hodayot, or Thanksgiving hymns, reflect an introspective spirituality that emphasizes divine mercy and human frailty. Their theological vocabulary sometimes parallels expressions later found in rabbinic and early Christian sources, though direct lines of influence remain difficult to establish. The scrolls also preserve Aramaic compositions that expand the narrative world of the Hebrew Bible. Texts such as the Book of Giants and other Enochic materials reflect traditions circulating beyond the boundaries of what later became canonical scripture. These writings contribute to an understanding of Second Temple Judaism as a dynamic literary environment, in which stories were retold, interpreted, and elaborated in creative ways. One of the most consequential debates in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship concerns the degree to which the Qumran community stood apart from mainstream Judaism. Early interpretations tended to emphasize sectarian isolation. The community rule, the Damascus document, and related texts describe strict admission procedures and disciplinary measures. The community appears to have viewed itself as the true interpreter of the covenant, contrasting its practices with those of other Jewish groups. However, more recent research has highlighted points of continuity as well as divergence. Many of the legal discussions in the scrolls engage issues that were also debated among Pharisaic and Sadducean circles. Questions regarding purity, temple sacrifice, and Sabbath observance were widely contested. The scrolls do not represent an entirely separate religious system. They reflect one strand within a larger tapestry of Jewish thought. The destruction of Qumran around 68 CE marks a turning point. Archaeological evidence indicates that Roman forces passed through the region during the suppression of the First Jewish Revolt. The settlement shows signs of violent disruption, though the precise sequence of events is still studied. The concealment of manuscripts in the nearby caves may have occurred in anticipation of this upheaval. If so, the scrolls were hidden at a moment when the future of Jewish communal life was uncertain. The subsequent fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 70 CE reshaped Jewish history. Groups closely tied to temple administration, such as the Sadducees, disappear from the historical record after this period. Rabbinic Judaism gradually emerged as a central organizing force, emphasizing study of the Torah and adaptation to life without a central sanctuary. The Qumran community, if it survived beyond the Roman campaign, left no clear trace in later sources. The scrolls thus capture a snapshot of Judaism before this transformation. They preserve theological concerns and institutional forms that did not continue in the same configuration after 70 CE. For historians, this pre-destruction perspective is invaluable. It allows comparison between competing interpretations of the law and differing expectations about divine intervention. The impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls extends into the study of early Christianity. Scholars have long observed parallels between certain Qumran expressions and themes found in the New Testament. Concepts such as a new covenant, ritual immersion, communal meals, and eschatological expectation appear in both corpora. The language of light and darkness, prominent in the community rule, also appears in the Gospel of John and other early Christian writings. It is important, however, to approach these parallels with caution. Similarities may reflect shared cultural and theological frameworks rather than direct borrowing. Both the Qumran community and early Christian groups emerged from within Second Temple Judaism. They drew upon common scriptural traditions and participated in ongoing interpretive debates. The scrolls do not demonstrate a direct genealogical link between Qumran and the early church, but they clarify the religious vocabulary and expectations circulating in the first century. The publication history of the scrolls has itself become part of modern scholarly discourse. For several decades after their discovery, access to certain manuscripts was limited to a small editorial team. This restriction generated criticism and speculation. Beginning in the late 20th century, broader access was granted, culminating in comprehensive photographic releases and digital archives. Today, institutions such as the Israel Antiquities Authority and various research libraries have made high-resolution images publicly available, enabling independent analysis. Technological advances have also enhanced study of the fragments. Multispectral imaging has recovered faded text invisible to the naked eye. Digital reconstruction tools assist in matching fragments based on fiber patterns and ink composition. These methods have refined readings and, in some cases, corrected earlier interpretations. As scholarship progresses, the scrolls continue to resist simplistic characterization. They neither overturn the foundations of biblical tradition nor confirm a single, unified narrative of ancient Judaism. Instead, they reveal a complex intellectual landscape in which Scripture was central but not static. Interpretation, debate, and adaptation were integral to religious life. The hidden secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls are not secrets in the sense of concealed doctrines. They are insights uncovered through sustained study, evidence of textual plurality, communal discipline, theological reflection, and historical contingency. In the arid caves above the Dead Sea, manuscripts endured that now allow modern readers to encounter the diversity of voices that shaped Jewish thought in a formative era. Their preservation was accidental, but their significance is enduring, anchored not in speculation, but in the patient accumulation of archaeological and textual evidence. As research on the Dead Sea Scrolls advanced through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, attention increasingly turned from the dramatic circumstances of their discovery to the subtler questions of interpretation, context, and long-term historical impact. The manuscripts themselves remained unchanged, fragments of parchment and papyrus marked by time, but the frameworks through which scholars approached them evolved significantly. One area of sustained inquiry concerns the social structure of the group or groups associated with the scrolls. The community rule and related documents describe a disciplined body governed by hierarchical leadership. References to priests, Levites, and lay members suggest internal differentiation of authority. The council of the community appears to have exercised judicial oversight, evaluating conduct and enforcing regulations. Penalties for infractions ranged from temporary exclusion from communal meals to longer periods of separation. The emphasis on ritual purity is consistent across several texts. Immersion in water is described not merely as a physical act but as part of a broader spiritual transformation. The scrolls link purity with obedience to revealed law, suggesting that ritual practice and ethical conduct were inseparable. Archaeological evidence from Qumran supports this picture. Numerous stepped pools identified as mikvoti indicate that regular immersion was integral to communal life. The investment required to construct and maintain these installations in a desert environment reflects deliberate commitment. At the same time, the scrolls articulate a theology of election. The community portrays itself as chosen to preserve correct interpretation of the covenant. This self-understanding does not necessarily imply total isolation from other Jews, but it does indicate a sense of distinct identity. The language of separation appears in contrast to what the texts describe as misguided leadership in Jerusalem. Yet historians remain cautious in equating these criticisms with identifiable historical figures. Titles such as the wicked priest or the man of the lie are not accompanied by secure chronological markers. Attempts to match them with known high priests or political actors have produced competing hypotheses, none of which commands universal agreement. The role of the teacher of righteousness remains similarly debated. The scrolls present him as an authoritative interpreter of Scripture who endured opposition. Some scholars situate him during the early Hasmonean period, perhaps in connection with disputes over high priesthood appointments in the 2nd century BC. Others argue for later contexts. Because the texts lack explicit dates, reconstructions depend on indirect clues, linguistic style, paleographic dating, and correlations with broader historical developments. The evidence suggests that the teacher was a real figure remembered within the community, but the details of his life remain uncertain. The broader political environment of Roman Judea provides essential context. By the 1st century CE, tensions between Jewish groups and Roman authorities had intensified. Discontent over taxation, governance, and religious interference contributed to periodic unrest. The outbreak of the First Jewish Revolt in 66 CE marked a decisive escalation. Roman forces under Vespasian and later Titus advanced through Judea, subduing resistance. The archaeological destruction layer at Qumran, dated to around 68 CE, corresponds chronologically with this campaign. Whether the Qumran community actively participated in the revolt is unknown. The war scrolls' detailed battle scenarios have sometimes been interpreted as evidence of militant expectation. However, it remains unclear whether these descriptions reflect practical plans or symbolic expressions of apocalyptic hope. The scrolls do not contain explicit references to the events of 66 to 70 CE. Their silence on the fall of Jerusalem may indicate that the manuscripts were hidden before news of the temple's destruction reached the region, or that they were deposited gradually over time. In the decades following the Roman victory, Jewish society underwent profound transformation. The temple, central to sacrificial worship and priestly authority, was gone. Rabbinic leadership gradually consolidated around study of Torah and the development of halakhic discourse. The forms of communal life described in the Qumran scrolls do not reappear in later sources. This absence has led some scholars to conclude that the community either dissolved during the revolt or was absorbed into other movements. The archaeological record offers no definitive trace of continuity. The long modern process of editing and publishing the scrolls introduced another layer of complexity. Early editorial teams faced the challenge of reconstructing texts from thousands of fragments, many no larger than a coin. Assigning fragments to specific manuscripts required meticulous comparison of handwriting, fiber patterns, and textual content. In some cases, initial reconstructions were later revised as new fragments were identified or as imaging technologies revealed additional lines of text. Debates over access and publication shaped public perception of the scrolls. For many years, the slow pace of release led to speculation that important findings were being withheld. When full photographic archives became available in the 1990s, independent scholars were able to evaluate readings directly. The broader academic consensus that emerged did not support claims of suppressed doctrines. Instead, detailed study reinforced the understanding that the scrolls enrich knowledge of Jewish textual traditions and sectarian diversity without undermining established historical frameworks. Technological innovation has continued to refine analysis. Multispectral imaging has enhanced legibility of faded ink. DNA testing of parchment fragments has been used to determine whether pieces originated from the same animal skin, assisting in reconstruction. Digital databases allow researchers to compare variants across manuscripts rapidly. These tools have shifted Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship from a primarily philological discipline to one that integrates archaeology, materials science, and digital humanities. The scrolls have also influenced broader methodological discussions within biblical studies. The recognition of textual plurality in the Second Temple period has encouraged scholars to approach the formation of the Hebrew Bible as a gradual process rather than a single definitive event. Canonical boundaries, it now appears, were still fluid during the era represented by the scrolls. Some texts that later fell outside the Jewish canon, such as certain Enochic writings, circulated widely and were valued within specific communities. This fluidity does not imply doctrinal instability, but it underscores the dynamic character of scriptural authority. Communities define themselves in part through the texts they preserved and the interpretations they advanced. The Qumran library reflects deliberate selection. Certain books appear in multiple copies, while others are absent. The absence of Esther, for example, has generated discussion. Some suggest theological reasons for its exclusion. Others caution that the evidence may simply reflect incomplete preservation. Interpretive caution remains a hallmark of responsible scholarship. Where evidence is fragmentary, conclusions must remain provisional. The temptation to draw sweeping narratives from isolated phrases is tempered by the recognition that the scrolls represent only a portion of ancient Jewish literature. They illuminate one segment of society, not its entirety. Yet the cumulative weight of the evidence has altered the contours of historical understanding. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that Second Temple Judaism was neither monolithic nor static. Competing interpretations of law, divergent calendrical systems, and varying eschatological expectations coexisted within a shared scriptural framework. The scrolls provide concrete documentation of these differences, grounded in manuscripts whose authenticity is established through archaeological context and scientific dating. In museums today, carefully preserved fragments rest behind glass, their ink faint but legible. Institutions such as the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem display the Great Isaiah Scroll, unrolled in controlled light and climate. Visitors encounter not an abstract symbol, but a tangible artifact produced more than 2 millennia ago. Its columns of Hebrew script bear witness to a scribal tradition committed to preservation and transmission. The enduring significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls lies in their capacity to connect modern inquiry with ancient practice. They do not speak with a single voice, nor do they resolve every historical question. Instead, they invite sustained engagement, careful reading, comparison, and contextualization. Through them, the contours of a formative period come into sharper focus, a time when communities sought to define faithfulness amid political change, when scripture was both inherited and interpreted, and when the written word served as the vessel of continuity in an uncertain world. In the decades since their discovery, the Dead Sea Scrolls have become an enduring point of reference for historians of religion, textual scholars, and archaeologists alike. Their significance does not rest on dramatic revelation but on the steady accumulation of evidence, material, linguistic, and historical, that deepens understanding of a formative period in Jewish history. As scholarship has matured, the scrolls have come to be seen less as isolated curiosities and more as integral components of the broader landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean in the centuries before the Common Era. One of the most lasting contributions of the scrolls lies in their illumination of textual transmission. Prior to their discovery, reconstructions of early biblical history relied heavily on medieval Hebrew manuscripts, ancient translations such as the Septuagint, and quotations preserved in later literature. The Qumran manuscripts bridged a chronological gap of more than a millennium. They demonstrated that many features of the later Masoretic text were already firmly established by the late Second Temple period. At the same time, they revealed that textual variation was an accepted reality. Scribal culture allowed for differing recensions of certain books, and no central authority appears to have imposed a single uniform version across all communities. This recognition has reshaped modern textual criticism. Instead of searching for one definitive, original text in a narrow sense, scholars increasingly speak of textual families and developmental stages. The scrolls show that scriptural transmission involved both preservation and adaptation. Minor orthographic variations, alternative readings, and differing arrangements of material reflect a living tradition rather than rigid standardization. The stability of many passages, particularly in books such as Isaiah, coexists with meaningful diversity in others. Equally important is the insight the scrolls provide into communal identity. The sectarian documents from Qumran reveal a group deeply concerned with covenantal fidelity. Their rules emphasize disciplined conduct, hierarchical leadership, and ritual purity. The community understood itself as entrusted with correct interpretation of divine law. Whether or not it corresponds precisely to the Essenes described by Flavius Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, the parallels between literary description and archaeological remains suggest that such disciplined associations were part of the religious environment of the time. The Roman conquest of Judea and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE marked the end of the world reflected in the scrolls. The temple's fall altered the structures of authority and worship that had defined Jewish society for centuries. Rabbinic leadership, centered on study and interpretation of Torah, gradually emerged as a dominant force. The Qumran manuscripts preserve a pre-destruction perspective, capturing debates and expectations before this decisive turning point. Their silence regarding the temple's destruction reinforces the likelihood that they were hidden in anticipation of conflict rather than composed in its aftermath. Modern scientific techniques continue to refine understanding of the scrolls' material history. Radiocarbon dating confirms their placement within the Second Temple period. DNA analysis of parchment has revealed that some fragments once thought unrelated originated from the same animal skins, enabling more accurate reconstruction of individual manuscripts. Multispectral imaging has recovered lines of text previously invisible due to fading. Each technological advance strengthens confidence in readings while reminding scholars that interpretation remains an evolving process. The scrolls have also influenced interreligious dialogue. For Jewish communities, they testify to the depth and antiquity of scriptural tradition. For Christian scholars, they clarify the diversity of Jewish thought in the era in which early Christianity emerged. Parallels in vocabulary and expectation, such as references to covenant renewal, ritual immersion, and eschatological hope, are best understood within the shared matrix of Second Temple Judaism. The scrolls neither diminish nor supersede later traditions. They contextualize them within a complex historical setting. Public engagement with the Dead Sea Scrolls has expanded significantly in recent decades. Exhibitions in Jerusalem, London, New York, and other cities have displayed selected fragments under carefully controlled conditions. Digital archives now allow global access to high-resolution images, enabling students and researchers far from the Judean desert to examine the manuscripts directly. This democratization of access contrasts with the early years of limited editorial control, reflecting a broader commitment within scholarship to transparency and collaboration. At the same time, challenges remain. The antiquities market has occasionally produced fragments claimed to belong to the Dead Sea Scrolls corpus. Scientific analysis has demonstrated that some of these pieces are modern forgeries. Such incidents underscore the importance of archaeological provenance. The original Qumran discoveries were documented within a controlled excavation context, providing a reliable framework for authentication. Without secure provenance, claims of association with the scrolls cannot be sustained. The caves themselves continue to be studied. Surveys of the Judean desert have identified additional sites with material from the Roman period. In some instances, small fragments of biblical texts have been recovered, confirming that the region served as a refuge during times of upheaval. These discoveries reinforce the broader historical picture, that communities in Judea responded to crisis by safeguarding valued writings in remote and defensible locations. The enduring legacy of the Dead Sea Scrolls lies not only in the texts they preserve but also in the methodological lessons they impart. They demonstrate the necessity of integrating archaeology, philology, history, and scientific analysis. They illustrate how fragmentary evidence can, when carefully assembled, illuminate an entire era. They caution against oversimplification while rewarding patient inquiry. In the arid stillness of the Dead Sea region, the caves that once concealed parchment jars now stand as silent witnesses to preservation through circumstance. The manuscripts they sheltered were neither intended for modern audiences nor composed with an awareness of future discovery. They were products of a community striving to live in accordance with its understanding of divine instruction. Their concealment was likely an act of protection amid uncertainty, not a gesture toward posterity. Yet posterity has inherited them. Through sustained scholarship, the fragments have been reassembled into legible texts. Through balanced interpretation, they have been situated within the broader narrative of Jewish history. They do not overturn established traditions, nor do they confirm dramatic revisions of the past. Instead, they enrich understanding, clarifying the development of Scripture, documenting diversity within ancient Judaism, and preserving voices that would otherwise have been lost to time. The hidden dimension of the Dead Sea Scrolls is therefore not secrecy but survival. Buried in caves overlooking one of the Earth's most inhospitable landscapes, they endured across millennia. Their recovery has reshaped academic study by grounding inquiry in material evidence rather than conjecture. In their faded ink and weathered parchment, they testify to a world of disciplined study, contested authority, and steadfast preservation. Through them, the intellectual and spiritual currents of the Second Temple period remain accessible. Fragmentary yet coherent, distant yet foundational, preserved against expectation and studied with enduring care.